Donald Trump has threatened to bomb the out of his ally, Oman. He's also threatening to reduce his support for another friendly nation, South Korea, while praising its enemy, North Korea. And in slightly more normal diplomatic news, he sent his son-in-law to pressure Israel to sign up to his peace deal in Gaza. There's a lot going on in Trump world. We'll try and work out what's likely to happen and what's not likely to happen in this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and shortly we'll be looking at some British domestic politics. But first of all, we're going to look at the two sides of Donald Trump that have been on display in the last 24 hours. On the one hand, you've got high-wire diplomatic Donald, where he is trying to cajole Israel into signing up to the peace plan in Gaza, which they recently rejected. And then on the other hand, you've got quite ranty on Truth Social Donald Trump, where he's made two quite dramatic threats against erstwhile American allies. So here to help us reconcile those two very different faces of Donald Trump is the BBC international editor, Jeremy Bowen. Hi, Jeremy.
Adam, it's good to be back.
Right, a few things to discuss. Let's talk about the Middle East first of all. And it seems like Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is on a bit of a mission for his father-in-law.
Yeah, if we think back to October when they did the deal which resulted in the ceasefire in the Gaza war, a lot of people, not least myself, were saying, look, to make this work, it's going to lead a lot of diplomatic attention. It hasn't had that. So where are we now? Late August? It's virtually a year. More than 1,200 Palestinians have been killed by Israel in that period inside Gaza. The UN has said that the level of demolitions and destruction there has increased by 9%. That's based on satellite information. So Israel is still destroying things. Not enough stuff is getting in. But what's happened is that Hamas have finally agreed, after a lot of work, not least by the Qataris and the Turks, they have finally agreed to disarm. But Israel has said, they're not going to take part in that agreement because they don't believe Hamas. And Kushner is there essentially to try and push this thing forward because Donald Trump needs a success.
But first of all, he met Hamas, didn't he? Or representatives of Hamas.
Yeah, he did. And the Americans under Donald Trump are way less squeamish about doing things like that than previous administrations would have been. And he was in Cairo. And now he's jetted over to Jerusalem, where he's been speaking today with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
And because previously the Israelis had rejected the deal, even though Hamas had said, actually quite historically, we're willing to give up our weapons. So what is going on with the Israelis now then?
Well, Hamas is an organization absolutely wedded to what it would call the armed struggle against Israel. So giving up its weapons is a very big deal, or saying they're prepared to do it. The thing is, They say, yeah, we'll do it if Israel pulls out of Gaza. Israel doesn't want to pull out of Gaza for a variety of reasons, not least internal political ones. They've got elections in November. There are no votes in doing something like that. So the Israelis have said, we reject the deal. We're not going to do the deal. We don't trust Hamas. And the answer from, not least from the diplomat who works for the Board of Peace, who's called Mr. Mladenov, the Board of Peace is Donald Trump's idea to try and make this whole thing happen. He said, look, this agreement is not based on trust. It's based on lack of trust. We accept that neither Hamas nor Israel trust each other one iota. So the idea is it will be verifiable. But that is not enough, it seems, for the Israelis and for Netanyahu. Netanyahu is trailing in the polls. He has members of his cabinet who say things like, for example, the national security minister in charge of the police, Itamar Ben-Gvir. He said, I think only yesterday, that Israel needs to be killing 30 or 40 people in Gaza a day and not to leave ever. And so Netanyahu is behind in the polls. He needs his right-wingers to vote for him. So he doesn't want to give anything up as far as Hamas is concerned. However, he's under pressure from Trump. I think that Netanyahu will play for time until the elections, and let's see what happens then.
I mean, I'm just thinking back to when we were discussing the Hamas pledge or signing up to the dearmament pledge a few weeks ago when it first reared its head. And I remember asking you, because you've got experience of these things, is there a way of Hamas decommissioning that could ever satisfy Israel? And I still don't think we know the answer to that.
I think the answer is the only... Israel has said it will not withdraw, not just withdraw from Gaza, but withdraw within Gaza. And they control, I think, effectively 60, 70% of the territory. More than 2 million Palestinians are squashed into the remains. When Palestinians controlled the whole territory, it was still in one of the most overcrowded places on the planet. So imagine what it must be like. And from my perspective, it is imagine, because the Israelis will not let people like me in still into Gaza. And that is clearly because there is a lot of things going on there that they do not want people like myself to report. But anyway, the Israelis say they won't do anything until Hamas gives up all its weapons. Well, the whole point about this is meant to be a process. And that's inside, Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, his envoys' minds as well. So they're not going to make this happen if they simply say, it's okay, Israel, we absolutely agree with you. Hamas, disarm now. Hamas will just say, no, we won't do it.
Yeah, and the other part of the puzzle was a new civilian-led administration in Gaza so that Hamas aren't in charge anymore. Do we know if they're making progress on that?
Well, there's a lot of talk about it and a lot of work has been done and there are individuals involved in this, but nothing is going to happen until there's a deal on disarmament and a deal on withdrawal. Nothing is going to happen in terms of progressing this. And at the moment, unless Mr. Netanyahu changes his tune big time after meeting Jared Kushner, well, it's not going to progress.
You mentioned the Board of Peace, which Tony Blair is involved in, although he sort of says it's more of a sort of the board of Peace. It's sort of adjacent to the Board of Peace rather than being on it.
Let's not get too deep into the weeds of the institutional,
Oh, okay. Well, that was going to be my next question then. But Tony Blair is involved in this, isn't he? He's been there.
He's very involved. Tony Blair is very close to Jared Kushner, who is Trump's son-in-law, who, as well as being his envoy, is involved in a myriad business deals involving billions of dollars of Gulf money, particularly. So he's deeply embedded in all of this. Tony Blair is very close to him. Tony Blair has this very large think tank, I suppose you call it, foundation, Tony Blair Foundation. Institute
for Global Change.
Yeah, there you
TBI.
Go. So he's doing a lot of stuff. And he does employ an awful lot of analysts, and perhaps he's feeding in ideas. I imagine that's a lot of what goes on. And of course, Mr. Blair, Sir Tony, since he left office as Prime Minister an awfully long time ago, has never wanted to disengage from the great swirl of international diplomacy. So, yeah, he's still very much involved in that, no doubt advising. He has got a lot of experience in the Middle East. But he is not absolutely, there is no particular connection with the British government. In fact, I've spoken to senior British diplomats over the last year or two who at times when Blair has been saying things, have been saying, well, your guess is as good as mine, mate, because he talks to Israelis, he talks to the Americans, he won't talk to us.
Well, continuing our tour, though, so can we then look at Oman? So on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz from Iran. Have you seen Donald Trump's latest threat to them?
Yes, we will bomb the...
Yes, I'm glad, because I didn't want to say the swear word, and I was wondering if I could make use of it.
It starts with S, it ends with T, and
it has 4 letters.
4 letters, and it's brown.
3 of which are stars.
Yes.
In BBC language.
So, yeah, he will bomb the beep out of them if they get in the way of the deal with Iran. Now, I mean, to try and deconflict this, from whatever goes on his mind with the actual truth of what's going on is quite difficult. Essentially, the only real game in town now in terms of a negotiation is the negotiation between the Omanis and the Iranians about the way traffic will one day, perhaps once again, move through the Strait of Hormuz, essentially.
Because you could have ships hugging the Iranian coastline in one direction and then hugging the Omani coastline in the other direction.
And that is more or less the plan. So they actually have been making some, unlike the Americans, they have actually been making some progress. But Donald Trump is saying things like this because he is flailing around. He is enmeshed in a war that he is desperate to get out of. Of course, get out with a deal that he can trumpet as a victory. And the Iranians won't give him that. They gave that. It's actually 60 days ago now. And it was meant to have all come to some fruition by 60 days. They entered into these arrangements, And I think that actually the terms were pretty generous to Iran, and Trump was criticized for that. And I think perhaps they were hoping that the Iranians would pocket it and say, okay, fine, that's not a bad deal. But no, not at all. They don't believe anyway. And this is from their public pronouncements, things they've said online, think tanks and what have you. They do not believe that Israel and the United States are doing anything other than preparing for another round of bombing, that they want the pressure taken off the global economy and they will go back in and hammer them. So the Iranians are preparing for the next round of the war. They don't trust the Americans 1 inch. And you can't blame them, because in the course of the last, just over a year, when they've been negotiating on 2 separate occasions, America has bombed them. So so the situation now is that Trump is pretty bereft of ideas. His military are telling him that, you can threaten as much as you like, but if we go back into war with the Iranians, we're actually running out of interceptor missiles to stop their ballistic missiles. The Americans have burned through, I think, half their entire stock of Patriot interceptors, and they're using a Patriot, sometimes 2 of them, sometimes 3 of them, to shoot down drones which cost about as much as a pretty fancy second-hand car. If you were to buy a 2-year-old BMW, it's about the cost of one of these drones.
Yeah.
And the Americans are using multi-billion-dollar missiles, Patriots, to shoot them down, which take years to replenish those stocks. So they're in trouble. And so essentially, I think what this boils down to is that Trump is somehow in his mind, I think he maybe is clocking that he is presiding over a really serious strategic defeat for the United States, and worse for him, that this may be how his presidency is defined, as a loser, and that's something he will hate. So he's trying to get out of it, and he's flailing around. That's why he's actually threatening a country which is probably doing more than any other single country at the moment to try and make a deal.
Yeah. Which leads me to the conclusion that him bombing the anything out of Oman is highly unlikely.
No, he's not going to do it. It's the same way that it's now been forgotten, but a couple of days ago he said that he's shortly going to, once their victory is complete, the Americans will declare the Strait of Hormuz to be U.S. territory.
Oh, I'd missed that one. That's what happens when you're at the Edinburgh Festival.
Well,
you don't monitor Trump
Blinker,
second by second. Yeah,
he's probably might not say it again until he's just. He said it in one of his speeches. He has these rallies, and he came out with it. Everyone cheered. It's going to be U.S. territory.
Well, I'm then loath to maybe bring up our next subject, which is what he said about South Korea, basically providing less military support for South Korea to defend itself from potential aggression from the north, because South Korea didn't support the war against Iran.
Yeah, because, when they were needed. If you look at Donald Trump, his administration, and South Korea, it is very similar to the way he's approached NATO and Russia. He's saying nice things about
their enemies.
Dictator of North Korea, Kim, and he has said nice things over the years about President Putin. He's been hypercritical of his South Korean allies, hypercritical of his Western European allies, and it's the same kind of things. They're piggybacking off us. They're not, they're taking us. They're ripping us off. They're treating us like suckers. They actually, in terms of America's diplomacy, security in Asia, defending South Korea has been a major part of that since the end of the Korean War. And I think the armistice was, 1953, 54, something like that. And so that's when Korea was divided. So this is yet another American ally around the world who is thinking, this alliance we had with the US, well, it's not looking very good. It doesn't appear to be worth much, while Donald Trump is laying all around him, because he said he's once more trying to make overtures to the North Koreans, and he's rubbishing his allies in South Korea.
So Israel and Gaza, this threat to Oman, this threat to South Korea, is there anything that joins these 3 things up other than just, as you said earlier on, that Trump is feeling like he's losing and so needs to look proactive?
I think Donald Trump joins them up, and also his lack of a strategy. America has had incredible tactical success in Iran. In other words, they're really good at blowing things up and destroying stuff, and taking almost no casualties. But translating tactical success into a strategic gain requires, first of all, having an objective of where you want to get to.
Well, yes, because a strategy for dealing with Iran would have taken into account that Iran had the power to close the Strait of Hormuz and blackmail the whole global economy.
Yeah, and a lot of his advisors, I'm certain that a lot of very smart people in the United States, unfortunately, they're not among always the people who are making the decisions. And so he will have been told that this is what they will do, because everyone's known that they can do this for years, for decades. But he somehow persuaded himself, and of course, there's been a lot of reporting suggesting that his mind was partly made up for him. I mean, he's responsible for his actions. He's the president of the U.S., but his mind was partly made up for him, it seems, by Mr. Netanyahu of Israel, he said this is going to be a quick and easy victory. There'll be regime change. Nothing of the sort. Didn't think it through. Thought that this wouldn't happen. And now they're in a real mess as a result. And the Iranians, you can say that maybe they're getting a little bit too overconfident here because their economy is in a terrible state. They're blockaded by the Americans. They've got a lot of internal issues. But they calculate they can tough this one out in a way that the Americans can't. And you know what? They may even be right.
Jeremy, thank you very much.
Adam, it's a pleasure.
And now, turning our attention back to British politics, and Reform UK did a press conference today fronted by who they call their Shadow Chancellor, Robert Jenrick, where he promised to save an eye-watering amount of money, tens and many tens of billions of pounds from the welfare budget. Specifically, the welfare budget that goes to people who are unemployed and the welfare budget that goes to people with disabilities and need support to live. So, here to help us understand it all, because he was at the press conference and then speaking to Robert Jenrick afterwards, is political correspondent Joe Pike. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Adam.
Welcome back after our little trip to Edinburgh.
Wasn't it lovely?
Very nice. And here in the studio with me is Ben Chu from BBC Verify. Hello, Ben.
Hi, Adam.
Right, so Joe, set the scene for this big reform benefits announcement.
Well, benefits is something that actually most of the mainstream parties have been talking a lot about, think that the current situation and rise in benefit claimants is unsustainable. Of course, there's that particularly striking figure of around 1 million 16 to 24-year-olds not in education, employment or training. And so today, Robert Jenrick appeared in the Reform press conference room at Reform HQ to unveil quite a detailed 50-page radical or controversial plan, depending on your sort of view, of how Reform would completely sort of rip up the system and start again. I mean, I can go through the details, but this is a sort of wholesale change, which they say will save about £50 billion a year.
Well, let's break it down into chunks. And the first chunk we can look at, Joe, is their pledge that the benefit system would only be for UK citizens, as Reform say.
Yes, not wanting to send you back to Brussels immediately for more Brexit negotiations, but there would be a renegotiation of the withdrawal agreement under this policy, because people who are EU citizens with settled status in the UK are entitled to benefits. Now, the Conservatives want foreign nationals to no longer be able to claim benefits, but there is a sort of opt-out under the Tory policy for EU nationals with settled status. What the Reform Party want to do is stop them claiming the benefits too. That would require, as I say, some negotiations. There are also others who are concerned that UK nationals who are living in the EU and claiming benefits could also lose out. And in fact, I've just got back for a sit-down interview with Robert Jenrick, and he thinks there are a number of reasons, actually, why it's worth renegotiating the Brexit deal now, including fishing rights, including some other details around energy, and also differences in different countries. So his view is, it would require reopening the deal, but there are a lot of things this far out of the original deal that we should renegotiate. Of course, opposition parties say that's impractical, and it will drag us back into the Brexit debates of olden days.
And Ben, when you look at that dossier that Reform have put out today that Joe was talking about, and you look at the graph where they show the savings from this policy, which they call British benefits for British citizens, you realise the huge chunk of people who would stop receiving benefits are EU nationals who settled here as part of the Brexit process, and also people who have indefinite leave to remain. So people who've been here for long enough to sort of almost become British citizens, but not quite. And some people would say, oh yeah, they're technically immigrants, but actually they've made their home in the UK. They should be entitled to benefits.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. And to be fair to Reform, they are upfront about this. They're not trying to disguise the fact that they are trying to take away people's rights, these people who went through the Brexit process and applied for settled status and were given that right to benefits just like people in the UK. The bulk of the people from the EU nationals in the UK are on that scheme. But what Reform aren't quite so upfront about this. This is making big savings. This is almost half of their £50 billion savings plan. What they're not upfront about is that a lot of these people with indefinite leave to remain could then try to become UK citizens, and then they would be fully eligible to claim the benefits on a par with, in the same way as UK nationals would be. What that would do to their planned savings, they don't spell it out, but it could potentially massively erode it.
Although I noticed there's almost like a little footnote in the document that says, oh, and we will bring out plans later this year about making it harder to become a British citizen. So they've obviously tried to head off that attack, but just not with enough data to
I think
stop.
The other thing, just to bear in mind, Adam, £50 billion is a big saving. It's a big planned saving. And I want to just give you some broad context for these numbers. So the total UK welfare bill this year will be about £350 billion. But £150 billion of that is the state pension, which Reform have elsewhere said they're going to keep as it is. So they're not going to touch that. So that leaves about £200 billion to find savings from. So £50 billion, it's about a quarter of that remaining welfare bill. That's really significant. And of course, remember that Labour were trying to reduce the working age health and disability bill by about £5 billion. They couldn't get that through their own backbenchers. This is obviously much more significant and would presumably face a lot of the same kind of resistance, not just from MPs, but the general public who are in receipt of these benefits.
So that's the first chunk. Joe, the second chunk of reforms would be who gets access to disability benefits like personal independence payments.
Yeah, and on that, I think what was most interesting about the speech Robert Jenrick gave this morning was the reasonably nuanced tone he tried to strike. There was a message of reassurance in his language that those who are vulnerable or seriously ill, who definitely need what are now personal independence payments, will still get that support. But that also there will be different changes and different restrictions. Firstly, trying to get people on, as they would see it, sort of more minor conditions, including some mental health conditions, back into work, make it far more difficult to receive benefits, and also have more regular and tougher face-to-face reassessments.
And so what they're trying to do there is basically make sure that people with the highest needs get what they get now, but you would reassess lots of people so that they would lose their benefits. Or rather than getting cash benefits in the form of PIP regularly, they would get different kinds of assistance from the state, like maybe if they needed some kind of gadgets, or gadgets it sounds like a dismissive term, but technology for their home.
Absolutely. And what's most interesting from my conversation with Mr. Jenrick this afternoon is that he didn't give me, or wasn't able to give me, I don't know, maybe he didn't want to give me, their modelling of how many people are going to be affected. So if, as the plan suggests, they're going to be able to save about 23 billion a year through some of these policy changes around sickness and disability benefits, and you've got maybe 4.5 million people in England and Wales who get one or more of these benefits, the sort of vague calculation would be everyone loses about 5,000. But of course, everyone is not going to lose something. And therefore, does it mean half of them will lose 10,000? We are talking about England and Wales because, of course, this is devolved in Scotland. But my question to him was, if you can't give me the figures, your rival parties would say this is not serious. I suppose one explanation, possibly, I don't know this one explanation, is if he gave us a number, it might scare people. And maybe that's something he wanted to avoid doing. Because as Ben says, this is really massive, serious. The Conservatives say, it's sort of unworkably enormous in terms of what they're saying they can cut off the budget. I'm just slightly confused by that lack of clarity over how many millions are affected and how much they'll lose.
On the numbers, it's true at the press conference today, Robert Jenrick was not very forthcoming about the numbers affected, and even when pressed by Joe and others about the numbers. But there is, in the small print of this document, something that says 2.89 million people will be reassessed. So 2.89 million people on PIP will be reassessed. And Robert Jenrick gave or contributed an article to the Telegraph over the weekend where he used that figure as well, 2.89 million, and say we're not going to shy away from the fact that this will be tough for some people. So it seems that there is a number out there, but they've sort of downplayed it. That's pretty significant. So there's about 4 million people in England and Wales who receive PIP at the moment. So a pretty large chunk of them will, in the description in Robert Jenrick's article, said that that number could have their PIP claims modified or withdrawn. Now that could mean a lot of things, but potentially hundreds of thousands of people in scope for losing a significant share of the benefits they get in PIP at the moment.
And Joe, another thing that Reform are pitching is this idea of changing sickness benefits so that actually employers have to take out insurance so that they can keep paying their employees if they're off sick for a long time, so that those employees don't end up going into the benefit system. At least that's how it would work in Reform theory.
And their argument is it incentivises businesses to have a better and more regular, a better relationship and a more sort of regular contact with people who are ill. Now, they argue this would be cost neutral because of them scrapping those national insurance rises. So for businesses, they say there'll be no extra cost. Robert Jenrick conceded to me in my interview that there will be probably a cost in terms of time, and time is money in business, having to have more contact with staff. I suppose they're slightly delegating some of the responsibilities to business. Maybe there's a logic to that, but what he was basically arguing was that by the sort of current system means that businesses can sort of just almost forget about some of their employees. They point to the Netherlands, I think, where this system has been put in place in the past. I think it has gone well there, and it won't apply to the smallest businesses with just a handful of staff. But clearly, it would be a big overhaul. It would be complicated, and it would affect a huge number of people.
And also, Ben, it's a big change for business to provide that kind of service to their employees, which is currently provided to a lesser extent by the state.
Yeah, it would be a significant change. And I think that speaks to a broader point about significant change, because they're talking about getting rid of the PIP system entirely and having this new scheme which they would design from the bottom up. And there may be a case for that. But speaking to welfare reform experts, they say that the history over the past 20 years or so is that when you recreate a new system in the belief that it's going to cost less, sometimes it turns out to be the complete opposite. So PIP itself was introduced by the coalition government, you may remember, in 2013 to replace disability living allowance. And it was introduced on the basis that it would be less expensive than the previous system. And as the Office for Budget Responsibility has pointed out in numerous reports, it actually ended up costing more than expected. So creating a new system in the belief that it will create efficiencies, history shows it doesn't always work out like that. And reforms plans may have some merits, but you can't simply say, it's just because we're saying it's going to be cheaper that it necessarily will be.
Hope versus expectations. And Joe, another thing that they introduced in the coalition era was this idea of people who'd been on out of work benefits for a certain period. If they hadn't been able to find a job and they were still on the benefits, they would actually be put to work. And I remember Ian Duncan Smith introducing that. It got ditched because of court challenges in the 2010s, but a reform government would bring it back.
Yeah, welfare to work is what they're branding their version. Basically, if you are a long-term benefit claimant, take over a year in their plans, and you're fit to work, what they will encourage you to do is get you to provide 20 hours per week of work for your community, organised by the local council or by a charity. The examples he gave was this could be sort of picking litter, cleaning parks, helping community projects. And I suppose the argument that sort of Ian Duncan Smith, I'm sure, made all those years ago, like Robert Jenrick made today, was about people leaving their homes, playing a part in the community, and making links that could, of course, eventually lead to work. Arguments against it is this basically, free labour for councils, and will council workers who do similar jobs lose their work? And also there are sort of the legal and practical sort of questions that you've raised. What I think was most interesting about today is, one, there's been a huge amount of detail with all these policies you set out, Adam, but also the way Robert Jenrick has framed it is slightly sort of unreformed, certainly reform historically. This speech started with him referencing John Stuart Mill, the 19th century philosopher. He was talking about William Beveridge, whose report, of course, was the sort of precursor, the foundation to the welfare state. And I suppose it's fascinating to try and work out what he's trying to do in his seemingly early months in the party. There's already been this pretty successful shift in reform to professionalise their operation. You can definitely sense that. It is pretty slick in terms of their social media and their locations and events. This is also a shift under Robert Jenrick, I think, or his part of the party's policy, to a real sense of seriousness, wanting to be seen as having substantial, detailed policies. Look, they're clearly controversial, and opposition parties have criticised them today. But there's a huge amount of detail here, and he's trying to frame it in a sort of serious way. I suppose to argue that they're serious and prepared for government.
Well, yeah, and we've already done it in this conversation, harking back to the coalition government. That's what Reform do in their document, hark back to lots of previous attempts to do this, sending the message that this is not that far out of the mainstream.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because Reform are not alone in saying there's problems with the welfare system, problems in particular with the personal independence payment system, Adam. We've talked about Sir Stephen Timms' recent report where he said PIP is not fit for purpose. It's pretty much a solid consensus now that there does need to be reform. I think what really sticks out from Reform's plan is not so much the detail of how they want to go about reforming it, with the exception of the foreign nationals part. It's more the scale of the savings that they claim they're going to make. That a lot of experts will look at that and say it's just not feasible to do that much so quickly, given what we know about the history of reform attempts in this area.
But equally, it will make the Tories' numbers about savings for benefits, which are big too, but they're smaller than Reform's, so maybe they'll suddenly seem more realistic in comparison to Reform, so maybe Reform will do Kemi Badenoch a favour.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things we need to bear in mind on this, which is that it is true that the number of people claiming health and disability benefits has been going up pretty rapidly since the pandemic. So there is a real issue there, and Joe referenced the NEETs earlier as well. So it's not crazy to say this is something that the government needs to address, whoever is in government. At the same time, Adam, there's a really important bit of context, is that overall working age and children welfare spending is not rising anywhere near as fast as that particular subcomponent of it. And if you go back to 2010, we were spending about more than 5% of our national economy on those working age and children benefits. Today, it's about 4.8%. So it's not exploding overall, but the particular element of it, the health and disability benefit, is. So what has happened is the coalition cut lots of other forms of benefits. And the argument is perhaps people have been rushing into these health and disability elements to compensate, to keep their standard of living up. So it's a shift in the composition and the type of benefits people are claiming, rather than a soaring overall bill. So we should keep that in mind in these debates.
And then, Joe, just on the politics, the party politics of this, what are Reform's opponents saying?
Labour argue that all of this is fantasy economics. They say the plans are built on stripping support from disabled people and shifting costs onto employers. The Conservatives say it's a half-baked policy, and they claim it's aimed at distracting from Farage's fishy 5 million, as they call it, and what they claim is his embarrassing underperformance in his pointless by-election. And other parties, the Lib Dems and the Greens, have been equally critical in different ways, a lot of them talking about renegotiating Brexit is the last thing voters will want.
Joe, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.
And Ben, thanks to you too.
Thanks, Adam.